So if you have your book, if you don't, turn to Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 19. And we're looking at the next commandment. Words a little different than what we're used to. We memorize usually from Exodus 20. But this one says, neither shalt thou steal. And in Patriarchs and Prophets 309, it says both public and private sins are included in this prohibition. So it doesn't matter, whether it's something we do privately or something in front of other people. It says the 8th commandment condemns man-stealing and slave dealing. So, that was a practice that was breaking the Bible commandment. And we're told that that's going to rise again. Now, I don't know exactly what that means. It probably means Seventh-day Adventists are going to be made slaves. But in doing that, they're breaking that commandment. Also, it says, and forbids wars of conquest. Notice, it's not wrong to defend yourself against another country, but to go and try to take somebody else's country is wrong. Thou shalt not steal. That's their country. It condemns theft and robbery. It demands strict integrity in the minutest details of the affairs of life. In other words, you can steal a little bit or a lot. But this commandment includes even the little bit. And here's some of the ones that are kind of common. It forbids overreaching in trade. I've been reading Seventh Testimonies. And in the Seventh Testimonies, it talks a lot about the health food work. And one of the ideas that you get, welcome, is that the health foods that Seventh-day Adventists have produced, in general, have been too expensive. They don't follow the guidelines that were given in the 7th volume of the Testimonies. Over and over again, it says that we are to develop health foods that are cheap enough that poor people can afford them. Well, if we don't follow that, we're breaking this commandment, actually. You see, we're overreaching in trade. We have to charge too much. And there's just a lot of ways. One of the things I noticed and thought of when I read this commandment is that when I was in college, every once in a while, the school would really start cranking down on the students to pay their bill. And if they didn't pay their bill by a certain time, they'd get kicked out of school. So they'd put up their car, if they had one, and they'd sell it really cheap. And of course, some other Adventist comes along and says, wow, here's a good bargain. It looks like it's a good bargain, but actually they're taking advantage of the situation that the person is in. They have to get rid of it fast, so they think they have to put it low. But if we're going to follow this commandment, we would come to that person and say, that's not what it's worth. I'll pay you what it's worth. That's what we would do if we're going to follow this commandment. So, this overreaching in trade is a big thing. Yes?
A few weeks ago, I read The Art of the Deal by Mr. Jones.
Is that right?
And I wrote a letter to the Chattanooga paper. I said, this book is a prospectus for getting what I want.
Uh-huh.
To push until it comes my way, until I sit in the middle of the world and own the whole thing. That's Isaiah chapter 5, verse 8.
Yeah. Now, here's another one. You're at a yard sale, and you're you're knowledgeable about antiques, and the person has, $5 on this antique that's worth $100. They don't know that it's an antique. So we think, wow, this is a great bargain, But now if we didn't know it was an antique and we paid $5, that's different. But if we know it's worth that, and we're going to really follow this commandment, we're going to tell them. Now after we tell them, if they want to sell it for $5, that's fine. They have the right to do that. But we don't, as a Christian, want to steal from them. And so this thing goes really deep. And when you start thinking about being really honest, it's not that common to really be honest today and not steal. Here's another one. And requires the payment of just debts or wages. So if a person says, well, I don't feel like paying my debt, they're breaking the commandment. Now, if they're doing their best, they're earning the money and they can't pay the debt, that's a different story. But if we just ignore our debt and don't really, do our best to try to pay that debt, that's breaking that commandment. And lots of people are doing that today. One of the...
Strategic default.
Yeah.
Term for it.
Okay.
On housing. When people deliberately go into default on their house because they're upside down in it and they want to get out from under it.
Yeah. Well, if they can't help it, that's different. But if they could help it by either working or being a little more economical, finding ways in which they could do that, pay that debt. Every Christian is supposed to have a strong interest in making sure their debts are paid. Also, it works the other way. If we're hiring somebody and we're supposed to pay them a proper wage for what they do, and we don't, we cheat them on the wages, we don't give them as much as we should, then that's stealing too, because God sees the right they have to be properly paid. Now, of course, a person has the right to give that up. Like some people would say, well, yeah, you folks say, wow, what are stealing from your workers because you pay them so little. Actually, we pay more than what it looks like because there are benefits that people get. And when you add the benefits plus what's paid, it's more than a lot of people are getting today. So, but the professional people, they could get more money. So a person might say, you're stealing from them. But you see, we tell them ahead of time. They don't need to come and work for that if they don't choose to. And if the institute is better off financially, then we would pay them more. And so, that's, I don't feel that's a breaking of the commandment when it is understood on both sides and a person chooses to do that. Then it says, if you have the book, we're on page 35, reading under Deuteronomy 5:19. It says, it declares that every attempt to advantage oneself by the ignorance, see, there's where the antique idea comes in, advantage myself by the ignorance of this other person. Have you ever bought a car from an Adventist and they said, oh, it's a great car, there's nothing wrong with it? You get it and there is something wrong with it. Have you ever had that happen? You see, they are taking advantage. Now, if they didn't know, it's different. But they're taking advantage of your ignorance. You're buying the car from them. They know what's wrong with it. You don't. That's stealing. or misfortune. That's why I used the one about a student that's going to get kicked out of school if he doesn't sell his car fast. And so he's got a misfortune, and if we're not careful, we think, praise the Lord, I can get a cheap deal. But God says, no, you just stole from that poor student. It says to advantage oneself by the ignorance, weakness, or misfortune of another is registered as fraud in the books of heaven. So it's kind of a tall standard, isn't it? But I always like to remind, whenever I study these things with anyone, what we're looking at in the Ten Commandments is not a list of rules and don'ts. That's not what it's about. It's an insurance policy. And God is telling us, if you will let me live in you, I'll make you that honest. I will cause you to relate that way with everybody, and I'll make you feel uncomfortable if you don't do it. Yes.
James 5 tells us that fraud is a bad deal for the person who does it.
Right. We damage ourselves more than the person. So, God is promising to make us the kind of person that enjoys really being honest with someone. One case where I sold something, it was a rototiller, and I sold it for $50 because it did run, but it wasn't running in the greatest shape. So I sold her for $50, and I told the one that bought it, I said, if this quits on you in a little while, I don't know how long it's going to go, but I've got a better one, and so if this quits on you in a little while, just tell me, I'll give you your $50 back, because I would rather make sure that I don't take advantage of anybody than to think I'm going to get ahead a little bit, by putting too much on it. And I think that's what the Lord is calling upon us, to enjoy living that kind of lifestyle. After all, the prosperity comes from His blessing, not from being sharp in deals. But it comes from His blessing. That's where the prosperity comes from, if we're supposed to be prosperous. Now, sometimes the Lord allows us not to be prosperous, and that has its own training for us. But even when we are struggling and we're poor, we don't want to try to get ahead by taking advantage. We had an interesting situation at Wildwood there for a while. We were eligible for food bank items due to the pay scale. And so we signed up to get things from the food bank, and allowed the workers, I think it was once a week or twice a week, that they could come and buy food for pennies on the dollar, and like buy a box of Cheerios for 50 cents, that type of thing. And it was their way of helping people that needed help. But we noticed something that really bothered us. People would come, and they would come early before the thing opened so they could be in line, and then they would maybe sometimes they want to go do something, so they'd put a box there where they had stood, and they'd say, now that's my place. When I come back, that's my place. And when they got in, there might be a limited supply, like maybe there's 10 boxes of Cheerios, and the person would buy 5 of them and not stop to think about the other workers that might like to get a bargain as well. So if we're not careful when we're poor, we can even work harder at trying to advance ourselves in a way that's not appropriate. But we are to trust God. Jesus told us in Matthew 6 that the birds are taken care of, and we don't need to be afraid that we're not going to have food to eat or clothing to wear. He told us that. So it's better to trust Him than to try to take advantage of a situation. Now, I overreact the other way because I was brought up, with a strong, self-supporting concept. And so one of the things that took place in Washington, D.C., every Washington's birthday, they had a big sale. But there were only a certain number of things. And so people would camp out in front of the store overnight so that they could be the first one in the store to try to get that bargain. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to do that, but I never went. I didn't want to fight that crowd to get that bargain, and try to beat somebody else out of that bargain. So, hopefully, each one of us has a strong desire to not advantage ourselves over others and to try to make sure that others have what they need as well. Well, the next one, Deuteronomy 5:20, says, "Neither shalt thou bear false witness against thy neighbor." So, yes.
I'm trying, I didn't know what was ahead, but there are other ways of stealing besides monetary. Because we're told that a young
Can you hear back there? No.
we're told that a young man who steals a young lady's affections without the permission of her parents is stealing.
Yeah.
It's not just monetary things that we can steal.
Yeah, that's true.
Affections.
Yeah, I should have put that one in there, shouldn't I? Yeah, that's so much of that goes on today, In courtship, you win the heart of somebody, and then the parents would like to say no, but the child won't listen, and that's not good either. All right, there's also a statement in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29 that bears on this commandment. It says, "Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers." Now, it may be hard to recognize that's talking about the same commandment, but it is. It's calling us to a very high standard. Any corrupt communication like gossip, a lot of stories are passed around that aren't checked out to see if they're true. In fact, a lot of them are not true. Have you ever played this game called Gossip? The way it works is people sit in a circle, and the first person whispers into the ear of somebody a statement, and then they whisper it to the next person, and so on around the circle. And then the last one tells you what they heard. It's incredible. It's never the same. And sometimes you wonder, how in the world did they ever get that out of what was said? But you see, that's the way gossip is. So how can we tell the truth if we're going to gossip? We can't. So all these corrupt communications, Ephesians tells us, don't be involved with those. But what you say, let it be something that's going to build somebody up. It's going to make them a better Christian. It's going to make them more encouraged about themselves, about what they can do for God. And it expands it quite a bit. Now here's what Patriarchs and Prophets says. And some of you weren't here, I guess, when I started, but about the commandments. But there's a chapter in Patriarchs and Prophets that goes into detail about all the commandments. And we're taking some of that here. It says, false speaking in any matter. So if we tell something that's not really the truth, every attempt or purpose to deceive our neighbor is here included. Okay, so it's not saying if we make a false statement and later we find out it was false. That's not lying. Lying is when you want to deceive the person. You don't want them to know the truth, or you don't want to tell them the truth. So you tell something different. It's the purpose to deceive that makes it a lie. An intention to deceive is what constitutes falsehood. Now here's some very subtle ways we can lie. By a glance of the eye. So, we just show by body language something that makes them think something, but we just told a lie. A motion of the hand. An expression of the countenance. A falsehood may be told as effectually as by words. When we study communication, most of it is body language anyway. And so we watch each other and we read what they're saying to us. And if someone is saying one thing with their words and another thing with their body language, guess what? We believe the body language rather than the words. So here's very easy ways, when you feel caught. What am I going to say? Well, it would be okay to say it's none of your business in a kind way. Or I don't think I should reveal that to you. But to try to mislead them, to think something that's not true, that's not what God wants us to do. And as I've thought about it, suppose we're in the times of persecution. And someone knocks at the door. And we're hiding someone that they're looking for. And so they ask us, is so-and-so here? What are we going to do? Are we going to say, no, they're not here? But that's a lie. One thing we could say is, you're welcome to look. Now it would be better for a Christian to die rather than to reveal that the other Christian is there. It'd be better to die telling the truth. It'd be better for them to get mad at us because we don't cooperate rather than telling a lie. Yes.
I'm fully understanding what's being shared, but when I think of Rahab, and she misled the people so that they wouldn't capture the spies.
Mm-hmm.
And then later, of course, God rewarded her, saved her and her family and all that. It's hard for me to reconcile that she lied and she was outside of God's will in doing that while protecting God's people. That's almost a paradox.
Yes.
Can you explain that, perhaps?
Well, I've had the same question, and I don't know that I have 100% answer for that. But, God takes people where they are. And this lady was a heathen. She didn't understand the commandments. She knew that the God of Israel was more powerful than her God, so she wanted to follow the Israelite God. But I don't think she understood the Ten Commandments. So I sort of think the text in Acts where it says, in times of ignorance God winked at When she didn't know that that was wrong to do, he didn't hold her accountable on that one. Another thing that's very important, in the Bible, there's a lot of things that people do that the Bible's not saying do that. It's simply recording the story of what they did. Yes.
I was like about that. I was just thinking, like, so I don't remember which commandment, but it says, "Don't bear false witness against thy neighbor." What if it isn't against them?
Well, the problem is that, it was her neighbors in a way that were asking. You see, they wanted to find these spies.
Oh yeah, but I mean like in the
Right. Well, Jesus defines neighbor. It's really everybody. So I think it's basically, the emphasis is not on the word neighbor per se. Yes.
I'm thinking that, this is the way I see it. The commandment says, "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbors," and the Bible says the commandments are exceedingly broad, meaning that you should not bear false witness, period. Now, most of us bear false witness as Seventh-day Adventists. We say we are Christians, but when we go out in the world, we bear false witness, because no one can pinpoint that we are in Seventh-day Adventists. And so we blend into this worldly thing, and the angels which take in record says, "Well, why aren't you representing who you say you are?"
Mm-hmm.
And we don't pay attention to it. Sometimes we even come to church and be a false witness in the house of God.
It's true. That's very true. Now, another experience, because we're headed for these kind of experiences of persecution. In the communist time, there were various Adventists who would smuggle Bibles and other religious material, and they would sometimes make a secret compartment in their vehicle, and they would hide those articles in that and cross the border and try to, share those. And for a long time, I kind of thought, well, maybe that's fine. Until I read a story that was not about a Seventh-day Adventist, and his name was Brother Andrew. And he's known as God's Smuggler. If you've ever heard of that book, I could highly recommend it. He went to a self-supporting school in Scotland. And this was, back many years ago when communism was very widespread in Europe. And he learned at that school how to exercise faith. And so after his school, there's a lot of things I could tell you, but after school, he felt called by God to take Bibles into communist country. But he did it in a very honest way, with no false representation. He would take his VW, he would put Bibles in plain view on the front seat, in the back seat, but in plain view, and he would drive up to the border and he would pray this prayer: "Lord, make seeing eyes blind." He would his car would be looked at by the guard, and he would be waved through. Every time that happened to him. One time he was actually in a communist country and he stopped to eat his lunch, and some guards came by and they started, looking in his car, and of course the Bibles were right there on the plain view, and he prayed the prayer, "Lord, make seeing eyes blind." And so they got done their search and they went on their way. And I thought to myself, if a non-Adventist can do that, why do we have to hide? Why do we have to make secret compartments and make believe we don't have Bibles or don't have Why do we have to do that? You know, again, I suppose God takes people where they're at, but that's a very interesting contrast to what often has been done by Christians, not just Adventists, but many Christians have tried to smuggle. Yes.
I'm sure you remember the story from Corrie ten Boom, and the Gestapo came looking for the people that were hidden, and her sister said they're under the table. And it worked.
I did remember that, yeah. Yeah, in a secret compartment under the table. Well, anyway, we don't want to try to tell everybody exactly how your conscience should work, but just kind of stimulate you to think carefully about this. It says, all intentional overstatement. So, if we're selling a car and we just make it sound like a wonderful car, it's never given me any trouble, you know, overstatement. Every hint or insinuation calculated to convey an erroneous or exaggerated impression, even the statement of facts in such a manner as to mislead, is falsehood. So at the end, we can say, well, everything I told them was true, but the way we arranged the truth gave them the false impression. And they went away with a different picture than what the real picture was. This precept forbids every effort to injure our neighbor's reputation by misrepresentation or evil surmising. You know, more and more I think we need to go and ask to make sure that we have the story straight. If we feel we need to share, we need to ask to make sure, because you can see things and think such and such is the case when it's not the case. One story that I was told is that here was a couple, and when they left church on Sabbath, another Adventist brother saw them going into the grocery store and coming out with some groceries. Or maybe they saw them coming out with the groceries. They didn't probably see them going in. Well, you know, the first thing you're going to decide when you see that is that they're buying groceries on Sabbath. They're breaking the Sabbath. But when the story was checked out, what they discovered was that as this couple was leaving church, someone else that didn't have any food to eat approached them and wanted to have help, you know, with some food. Now, if we live close enough, we probably could just go home and get some for them or even invite them home. But anyway, they chose to solve the problem by going down to the store and buying some food and giving it to this person that was without food. Now, when you know the whole story, it changes your perspective. You still might disagree with that and feel some other solution, but at least you can give them the credit that they weren't just out there breaking the Sabbath. They had a purpose for what they were doing. So that's why evil surmising is so harmful, because if we tell that around, it damages their reputation to where maybe they aren't respected like they should be. Also, by slander, you know, one of the things I've noticed is that because we're brothers and sisters, we're not as careful about slander. But out in the world, they have to be careful about slander, because you can be taken to court over slander. And so people are a little more careful. But in church, we often are not careful. And we make statements that is slanderous. Now, to be slander, there has to be a purpose to hurt somebody's reputation. By slander or talebearing. That one's even more common. Just telling a story that we heard or that we thought we saw. That is usually lying, at least partly. Even the intentional suppression of truth. So we know what the truth is. The person is asking about something and we don't want to tell them, so we use a suppression of the truth. But there's another fact, by which injury may result to others. So if you just don't tell the truth but it doesn't hurt anybody, that's a different story. But if the fact that you didn't tell them the truth causes them to get hurt or to make a mistake, yes.
Honey, does this dress make me look fat?
What would you say?
Boy, that's a bad question. You know, or even how do I look in this dress? Or, you know, there's sometimes where you get into a spot where speaking is a dangerous subject.
Yeah,
Well, situations like that are relative too.
Yeah.
yeah. Well, you can avoid the question, too. You can say, well, you know, that dress looks nice on you. And maybe they'll forget the first question they asked.
What do you think of it? I don't know. There's sometimes when saying what you feel like saying doesn't really come across well.
Well, you know what I think God really wants us to be? He wants us to be so loving to everybody that they don't get hurt so much when we tell them the truth. You know, but if they feel not loved by us and we tell them the straight truth, it may really hurt. Even the intentional suppression of truth by which injury may result to others is a violation of the 9th commandment. So that's a packed paragraph describing what it means to keep the commandment, thou not bearing false witness against our neighbor. But don't get discouraged. You know, nobody can read this section and say, I'm a commandment keeper. Nobody can. All we can do is say, Lord, help me to be more of a commandment keeper. Help me to advance in keeping what you've asked me to keep.
And that brings up another kind of an interesting perception or situation, and that is, you know, I interacted with a bunch of Messianic Jewish people on a discussion forum once, and they were really proud of the fact that they kept all 500 and some laws. I said, you gotta be kidding. I said, you actually are capable of being perfectly holy on 500 and some laws? You can't tell me you're not a commandment breaker. So, but we Adventists come along and we kind of tout ourselves, we're the commandment keepers, and yet I haven't kept the Sabbath perfectly yet. And yet I proclaim that I'm a commandment keeper better than somebody else because I keep the Sabbath, and yet I can't do it any better. You know, I mean, I can't do it perfectly. And, you know, there's a certain bit of arrogance that can come into our commandment keeping status.
Yeah. Well, I think our attitude needs to be, I believe that all 10 commandments should be kept. And I'm striving to keep all those commandments. Not that I am a commandment keeper. I don't think we should think of ourselves that way. But we are striving, and we are reaching hold of Jesus because He's the one that lives out the commandments through us. And we're constantly, you know, reaching for more. Yes?
If somebody probes me on that, I usually ask them, which one of the 10 will the Holy Spirit lead me to reject?
Right? Yeah. The problem today is that most Christians believe in keeping 9, and some Christians believe in only keeping 8. But we're the ones that believe that all 10 should be kept. Okay, one more quote and we'll stop with that for tonight. This is just a short one. 2 Testimonies 4:66. Gossipers and news carriers are a terrible curse to neighborhoods and churches. Ooh, that's pretty strong, isn't it? Now, I used to work with a guy. He was a baker. And he was really a nice man, but he really had this problem. He's passed away now. I was working in a large Adventist hospital in Washington, D.C., in the baking and cooking area and kitchen. And you know, it was a steady stream every day, people coming to him, sharing news with him, getting news from him. And, you know, so much of it wasn't even true because it was gossip. It wasn't the actual truth. Certain people become the center of information. We don't want to be that kind of person. I'm glad I'm not that kind of person. For some reason, they don't choose me. One of the things that I do, when somebody tells me a story, I go and check it out. And if it's not true, I go back to the person. I tell them, you know, I went and checked on that story and it's not true. So that's probably some of why it deters people from wanting to tell me stories. But it says this is a terrible curse to the neighborhood and to the church. And then it makes this statement: 2/3 of all the church trials arise from this source. Wow. Just think, if we could get rid of 2/3 of the problems that exist in the church by one habit change, wouldn't it be worth it? Wow. We're down to only 1/3 of the problems to contend with because nobody gossips, nobody tells stories that are not true. And, you know, just because it is true, we don't have to tell it. If it's going to damage somebody else's reputation, we don't have to tell it. We don't have to pass it along. We do have a responsibility in Matthew 18 to help that get corrected. And if it's not corrected, then we may have a responsibility, you know, to go further. But certainly not just to pass it around, you know, to share the stories, because that hurts their reputation and it doesn't really change the situation usually. All right, well, we'll